wallowing in the
With that particular picture.
Yeah. We got the country into Europe, and that's a permanent historical beneficial act. Moving further and further to the right won't get supporters. And so we've got to live through this period until they then recognise that we're part of Europe, and that not only gives us obligations, but also gives us great advantages. I never once attacked Mrs. Thatcher. What I attacked were her policies. The party agreed with me and threw out what she was doing. And finally they threw her out. Morning.
Good morning, Sir Edward.
I'm sorry, I've been tied up in Singapore.
Very, very nice to see you. Just come through. I gather you like to sit here. We've got the all right chair.
Perfect.
So, thank you very much, Lisa. If you'd sit yourself down there. That's excellent.
Well, now what is the plot?
Right. We're from...
I can stay like this, can I?
Yes, that's excellent. Yes. Most of your time here now, how does it work? Because I see you're in the Commons a lot. I mean, what's the balance between being here and being in the Commons?
Yes. Depends to a considerable extent on what the business is in the Commons and so on. Then there are so many other things to be doing which are concerned with politics.
Yes.
Last week I had 3 days in Basel. Very interesting.
All right, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Don't go further forward than that.
No, I won't. I'll stay here. Sir Edward, 51 years in the Commons. When you look back, obviously there was the period when you were Prime Minister, but is there a period which you remember particularly, is particularly sharp in your memory?
Oh, it all is. It's very difficult to pick out one particular series of events, but I look at the time when I was elected to Parliament in 1950. For me, that was exciting. And after 10 months, I was then invited into the Whip's office by Churchill. So I immediately had access to the views of the top people in my own party. And we became the government in 51. So then I was at the centre of things in the Whip's office. And although people were rather astonished, I became Chief Whip in 55. And then you really do know what's going on. But I had a different approach to being Chief Whip because it seemed to me the important thing was not just carrying out the routine stuff and see if people have pairs or not. My job as Chief Whip was to give the best advice I could to the Prime Minister and his colleagues in the Cabinet. Then I had a deputy who did all the machinery, and that worked, as far as I was concerned, very well. But it meant that I was able to help Eden, I think. He didn't take notice of what I said over Suez. And then to help Macmillan, in which we had, despite everything, the great victory of 1959. I really had, 14 years, almost directly after I got in which I was in the centre of things. And so I endured it, if you like, from all angles, but I got to know the whole thing from beginning to end. So then I had a period in which I was still on the front bench when we were in opposition. And I was given the job of working out the policy of the party for Alec Douglas Hume. And then became leader, and that went on for 10 years. So it was the whole of that first long period in which I was right at the centre of things.
People often say that the importance of the House of Commons has diminished and that the quality of speaking is not so good, the quality of debate is not so good. What is your view when you look back to the early years when you were there? Has there been a great change?
Oh, enormous change, and for the worse. And in my view, it's going to take a long time to get the House of Commons back into its proper position. The reason is that under this government, the Prime Minister and his colleagues believe in doing everything they can outside of Parliament. And so all the important statements are made at breakfast meetings or lunch meetings or afternoon meetings and so on. And it's only afterwards that Parliament gets to learn about them. Another thing which has weakened it is that the Labour majority is so big that they regard themselves really as an audience a lot of the time. Prime Minister only comes into the House most times once a week, half an hour to answer questions. And The form of the questions is now very bad. But otherwise, I believe he's terrified of Parliament in many ways. And so everything is done outside of Parliament. As far as questions for the Prime Minister are concerned, he insists on just 1/2 hour on Wednesdays. That leaves him free to travel all over the country for the other days. But it's not good for Parliament because it makes him more remote in the rest of the week. And to have a 1/4 hour on Tuesdays and 1/4 hour on Thursdays gives you a much better chance of dealing with things which are absolutely topical. Of course, it's all changed since I was Prime Minister. Because at that time, any question to the Prime Minister had to be relevant to the Prime Minister's duties. Now they can ask anything. All they put down is, what is the Prime Minister doing today? And the inevitable answer for 270 questions is, I shall be carrying out my duties as Prime Minister. Then they can ask anything in the country, anything in the world that they want to, and the Prime Minister has to answer it. I noticed that with the present Prime Minister, when he came into office, he had no papers with him or anything, and just stood up and said, this is the answer. Then, of course, he found he couldn't keep that, and so he had a folder, and he opened the folder when it was necessary. Now he sits there on the bench, hastily turning over the pages and looking up and going over more pages. Then somebody whispers in his ear, and that's not really a very sensible way of carrying on.
You wouldn't envy him that task then? That makes it sound like it's more difficult to be Prime Minister now than it was in your day.
Well, it's not if... no, it's not. In fact, it's easier in some ways, as Mrs. Thatcher found. Because what she did was to have this great folder, and then whatever the question was and how it began and so on, so she just turned this over. And week after week after week went out with the same bit of stuff. It was easier.
Is there something about the Commons that you'll really miss?
Did I miss?
You will miss when you leave it?
Yes, one will miss having an absolutely up-to-the-minute information on what's going on. One can judge sitting there for oneself, as I've done, what people are really like, what their strong points are and their weak points and so on. As Father of the House, I've not thought it proper to interfere in all of these things, but that doesn't stop me watching and learning very quickly about what's really going on.
So if you want to keep in touch, you've got to be in the House of Commons.
Well, you can keep in touch, but if you want to be absolutely up to the minute, then I think probably you have to be in the House of Commons.
When you look back again at all the years you've been there, is there any period which you really feel was very difficult, very hard? You didn't enjoy the experience at all?
Well, of course, the part where the trade unions were deliberately trying to bring down a government was an unpleasant part. And this was against their own leadership, because the leadership of the TUC, we had the meeting at number 10. And he said, well, let me just take the vote and it's all going to be perfectly all right. He came to me. I said, you better have a sandwich first, have something to eat. It's now 1:30. All right, he said, we'll all have something to eat. And so about 2:30, he said, well, now we're going to have the vote. It'll be all right. And they had the vote, and he came to me in my study with a very long face saying, I don't know what happened, but we only got 4 votes. So that was a great disappointment, because we had been working very closely with the trade unions.
Did you find moving from government to opposition and backwards and forwards, is that a very strange experience to see you now sitting on the other benches? You've been on the government benches, you've been on the opposition benches. To the outsider, that must seem as though that's a very difficult adjustment to make.
It isn't, no. Not if you're going the right way about it. The job of the opposition is to put policies properly thought out, worked out, clearly expounded to the House and to the public. And in doing that, you have to recognize that you've got to satisfy a large section of the public. That's what we did from 1965 to 70, and that's why we were elected in 70. And all the pundits said, of course, they can't win the election. And one of the very senior members of my party came down to my constituency where we were having sandwiches and beer for lunch, and then took me on one side and said, I just want a quiet word with you because, as you know, you're going to lose the election. And my advice very strongly is that at 2 o'clock in the morning, whenever it is, you just announce that you've now retired. So I said, oh, well, thank you very much. Instead of which, 2 o'clock in the morning, I was going into central office, having got a majority. So people have been very helpful in many ways. Those 10 years were remarkable. And of course, what history will come to it, but what they don't appreciate, really, I think, through ignorance, is how much we did in 3 3/4 years. That's all we had in that government of 1970. And the first thing was we got the country into Europe. And that's a permanent historical beneficial act, even though at the moment the party said is against it, or the official party said is against it. But, and then we did so many things in home policy. We reformed the whole of the immigration situation and the immigration acts. We reformed the trade union position. And that was a major step forward. And I remember TUC secretary, I said to him, look, Victor, when we have our meetings, you never make any proposals to amend what we've put forward. If you criticize them, why won't you show us how to amend them? He said, my dear Ted, if you win the next election, these trade union acts are there forever. And if you lose the election, they'll be thrown out in the first week. So why should we do anything?
Do you take a gloomy view of your party's prospects now?
A human view. Yes, I take a very human view. I ask myself how they think they're going to get the votes.
You sound as though you don't hold out much hope for this election for the Conservatives.
Well, you see, the problem is that, the frightening thing for me is that it reminds me of '79 and the Labour Party. And when Callaghan went under, Michael Foot took over and, of course, swung the whole thing further back to the left. And then his successor went further still to the left. And that took 18 years. And it wasn't until the present Prime Minister came along that he changed the approach, and they then were successful in the election. Now, if our people are going on moving further and further to the right, that won't get supporters. And their attitude over Europe, nothing can be done about Europe for 10 years. And when it is done, they do what we tell them or else we're out. That doesn't appeal to a very large section of the former members of the party. And so I suppose we've got to live through this period until they then recognize that we're part of Europe, and that not only gives us obligations, but also gives us great advantages.
Many people will wonder, talking about your time in the Commons, about how difficult it was for you, having been leader of your party, having been Prime Minister, to then sit there with Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister. It's often been said that you found that very, very difficult. Did you really find it so difficult to do? How would you sum up that period of your life?
Well, of course, the press and radio and television and so on, and a lot of people who wanted to cause trouble in our party, said this was a continuous personal attack on Mrs. Thatcher. I never once attacked Mrs. Thatcher. What I attacked were her policies. And a lot of them were, I think they were all justifiable attacks. But when you got to some of them, the party agreed with me and threw out what she was doing. And finally they threw her out. Well, now, of course, she is going back on some of the things she accepted, especially as far as Europe is concerned. And I believe that one is justified in criticising the policies which are put forward by the leadership of your party and try to get them, as you believe, in the right lines. That's what I was doing.
Was it difficult to sit there and hear Mrs. Thatcher at the dispatch?
No, I find no difficulty in sitting there with other people. None at all.
Now, if we could look ahead, What are your plans? What are you going to be doing? What's going to dominate your life once you leave the Commons?
Oh, politics. I have to maintain my interest in politics, and well, I'm under so many pressures at the moment to do this and do that when I've stopped, when I've left the House of Commons. But they say, why don't you go to the House of Lords? Well, I don't see any purpose in that. It's always an open question. Harold Macmillan didn't go until right at the end of his life. Churchill never went. But in this House of Lords, which is a jumped-up business, it's really just Blair's Tory thing. And I see no point in taking part in that. I've said publicly, I've said it in the House, what I want now is a second chamber, which is a second chamber in its own rights. When the proposal put forward for reforming the Lords way back in '68, they were very sensible for the time. And they said, we'll cut down the number of bishops, but we'll still have bishops, and we'll introduce other forms of religion, and we'll limit the hereditary peerage, and then we'll put in other bishops. So, all right, well, that was worked out and balanced, and it got widespread support in the Lords. And a lot of support in the Commons. It was just unfortunate that the Home Secretary had to handle it when it came to the Commons was Jim Callaghan, who just had to give up being Chancellor of the Exchequer because of the devaluation of sterling. And the poor man was absolutely worn out. And on one side of me, he had Michael Foot, who said abolish the House of Lords. And on the other side, our fellow, what was he called, who said, oh no, we must take the House of Lords back to the 14th century, Enoch Powell. So between the two of them, they messed it all up, and Callaghan just couldn't stand it.
You mentioned that you're going to still be active in politics. What about the other things that we've all known that you've been so interested in over the years? Your music, for example, even your sailing. Is that going to continue in some form?
Music is part of my life. It has been ever since I was a kid. And if I don't get any music for 3 or 4 days, I feel starved. That goes on the whole time. Sailing, I stopped. We had 15 years at the top. We won the Sydney-Hobart race, one of the 3 great races. And we won almost every race in this country. And so having done all of that after 15 years, I said to them, right, we're not going down the waves, we're going out. So we stopped. And all sorts of people have tried to persuade me to race with them, but I don't fancy doing that sort of thing, because if you're not the skipper, you can't control everything. And then things go wrong. And of course, all the sailing boys report, and look what happened to this boat. And Heath was on it. So.
You get the blame.
Exactly. So I said, right, we're out. Of course, I watch it, and I'm down at Cowes and on the Solent and elsewhere. And at the beginning of this year, we had a great celebration of 30 years since we won the Sydney-Hobart race. And we said, we were a crew of 6. 1 has since died, 1 was too ill to come, so we were 4. We said this will just be a nice little party around a table with a bottle of wine, instead of which some 250 turned up in order to celebrate our victory.
Can I ask you one more thing? We're all right, aren't we, for the moment? One more thing that struck me from what you've just saying. When you were Prime Minister, we know that you enjoyed your music.
Yes.
You went sailing.
Yes.
Do you think Mr. Blair could learn a lesson from the sort of activities you had outside politics while you were Prime Minister?
Do I think he could do them?
Well, should he have, what I'm saying to you, should Mr. Blair take a lesson from you and have other things in his life apart from politics?
Yes, but then you just can't say to somebody, you're going to have other things and there'll be this, that and the other. Either he has them, has grown up with them, and they're important to him, or else he hasn't. And all too often politicians, I suppose Mr. Wilson was the extreme example, didn't have any outside interests. He used to sit late into the night smoking his pipe and drinking his brandy and talking to his select 3 or 4 as to what they were going to do. I believe if you have other interests, then it strengthens your attitude to politics and the decisions that you take. Yeah, I used to sail as a channel race. We went off on Friday evening and got back on Sunday morning, I think. And if it was a certain race where we went off at 8 o'clock in the morning, finished about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, went back to the club and had a shower and a bath and had a malt whiskey, and felt entirely refreshed. And then as the crew, we always had supper together and argued about what we'd done right and what we'd done wrong. And then we went back to Chequers, usually the Prime Minister's house. And you feel entirely refreshed and say, well, now what are the problems I've got to deal with here? So I think that's very important in life in any case. Businessmen who do nothing but business do become a bit of a bore.
And politicians the same.
Exactly.
Sir Edward, thank you very much indeed.
Not at all.
Do you have a great collection of sailing pictures? I mean,
yes.
That one, for example.
Yes. That made me the most hated man on the serve.
Why? Tell me why.
There he is, leading the fleet, absolutely upright. All his sails, well, look what they've done with the people behind, wallowing in the water.
With that particular picture.
Yeah.
Where did tell me this, your sailing come from? I mean, that bit from your boyhood, was it?
Yeah, I was born by the sea.
You were was it Broadstairs?
Yeah, Broadstairs.
Yes. And you sailed?
No, because I hadn't got any money.
How old were you then?
Oh, this was after the war.
Oh, I see. Right, yes, yeah.
The trouble was I didn't know what the hell to do with the cod. 145 pounds of cod.
Yes. What made you settle here in Salisbury?
Because I liked the house. I no longer had any connections with Broadstairs. My family had all gone. And it was very difficult to find a sort of quiet place. And I was suddenly told about this, so I came along.
Okay.